got a call from a modeling friend of mine asking if I wanted to drive up to the North Bay and look at an old HO layout that a friend of theirs wanted to revitalize, so I went to go look at it. It was there I met Mr. and Mrs. Potter, two of the kindest clients I've ever worked with. After looking over the layout itself, I happily agreed to help out. The layout was originally built in the 1970s when their now-grown kids were young. It had been built using contemporary kits and building materials of that time. The track plan was definitely influenced by the HO Model Railroad That Grows, an iconic model railroading book of the era. Mr. Potter put his own spin on it, modeling Northern California in the 1950s. I returned the following week with a concept sketch that helped clarify some ideas he'd wanted to implement for decades but never got around to it. An architect by profession, he wanted to rebuild his town to be more realistic with an improved street layout and accurate width roads. He also wanted to rebuild the swamp, freshen up the mountains, and do 21st century scenery techniques on the rest of the layout. My favorite bit of this plan was re-gauging the scratch-built swamp trestle to 30-inch gauge to snake around the town. Then the narrow-gauge train takes the logs back to the mill, where they're dumped into the pond, milled, kiln-dried, and then stacked. First things first though, cleaning out the layout and preparing it for work. The layout has languished in its near half-century of life in an uninsulated garage and was exposed to dust, UV, and probably somewhat substantial heat during the summer times. This meant we had our work cut out for us, as the cork roadbed he'd laid in the Carter administration turned to dust when it was even poked. Similarly, the scenery was mostly debonded and would need to be vacuumed up and repaired. Most of the track was also old brass track, and I suggested replacing it entirely with a surplus, new and used Code 100 track I had from working on another client's project. He agreed, and we set to work scraping up the desiccated cork and the UV-damaged brass track. It was a joy working with Mr. Potter, spending the afternoon together talking trains, architecture, and steadily rebuilding his layout. We realized that the tunnel was so fragile that it destroyed itself when we tried to do anything with it, so we removed it with the intention to replace it with a fresh mountain later. Word to the wise, never use canned spray foam as layout scenery. Even after decades in place, it was impossible to work with. It's also ridiculously sticky and makes unrealistic landforms that are much more difficult to carve than your regular pink or blue foam sheet. Eventually, to remove the spray foam, I had to use a chisel and a sawzall to remove it. It was a very difficult task, but we got it done. While working, we shored up the table with new legs after we noticed one was broken. With demo mostly complete, we vacuumed the entire layout, sanded the rights of way, and marked new center lines for gentler curves with easements. Then it was time to lay track, of which that went together very well and very quickly. Mr. Potter was ecstatic to have his trains running again, and we had a little golden spike moment once the loop was complete. Another task was drastically simplifying the hyper-complex wiring schema he'd developed to prevent unauthorized train movements by his kids when Dad wasn't around, following 2 derailments ending with engines hitting the floor. Since the chances of that happening with grown children are minimal, we simplified it to just a 2-block operation using 2 old MRC Tech 2 throttles as a power supply. We removed what seemed like miles of wiring. Next, we repaired the original plywood base for the outer main line and began laying track on that. Tragically, Mr. Potter passed away before we could get any farther. I'll always deeply cherish the time we spent together bringing that 70's layout back to life. Mrs. Potter called me in to dismantle the layout and assess the collection of trains, which I did dutifully. I bought some myself and found good homes for the rest of the equipment. Dismantling the layout came quickly. Everything modeling related was boxed up carefully. And then the Sawzall made quick work of the layout. It all got loaded into their pickup for the final trip to the landfill. While sorting through everything, I found all the rolling stock from his home road, the Mom, Dad, and Kids Railroad, or MDK. And I set that aside to give to Mrs. Potter and the children. As a tribute to Mr. Potter, I had Mrs. Potter run the final train around the layout before it was dismantled. It was a tear-filled and bittersweet moment, but a necessary coda. Although we didn't get to fully realize the dream, the most important part of modeling is spending time building something you enjoy. This layout gave the Potter family decades of enjoyment. May it live on in this video and in our hearts.